The billionaire laughed, pointing at the hotel janitor. "If you can play this piano, I'll marry you," he sneered. But when the janitor's fingers touched the keys, the entire room froze. What happened next left the billionaire speechless and the crowd on their feet. "You? Play my piano? Huh. If you can play this perfectly, I'll marry you right here and now." The arrogant words sliced through the air like a knife, echoing under the high, domed ceiling of the hotel lobby. A hush fell instantly. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, the faint background music from the bar, all of it stopped as if the world itself had frozen. Heads turned, eyes darted toward the source of the challenge. It was Edward Stanton, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal suit, the kind of man whose mere presence commanded attention. His dark hair was slicked back with meticulous precision, and in his right hand he cradled a delicate champagne flute, swirling it lazily as if bored with life itself. His smirk was the kind that belonged to someone used to getting exactly what he wanted, someone who saw the world as a game, and people as pieces to be moved at his whim. The target of his ridicule stood just a few steps away. Marcus, the hotel's quiet, humble janitor. He was dressed in a simple navy uniform with faint bleach stains on the sleeves and worn black shoes that had clearly seen years of service. His posture was slightly stooped from hours of physical work, and in his hand, he held a yellow mop handle, its damp strands leaving faint streaks of water across the gleaming marble floor. Moments earlier, Marcus had simply been doing his job, cleaning near the grand piano that stood in the center of the lobby, its polished black surface reflecting the golden glow of the chandelier above. The instrument was as much a centerpiece of the hotel as the ornate staircase or the massive floral arrangements. Guests occasionally played it, filling the air with soft melodies that blended into the refined atmosphere. But Marcus never touched it, at least, not when anyone was watching. Edward and his group of wealthy friends had been lounging nearby, their expensive suits shimmering under the light, diamond cufflinks catching every glint. They sipped aged whiskey and fine wine, laughing too loudly, their voices carrying across the lobby in a way that demanded attention. It had started innocently enough. One of Edward's friends, a younger man with a narrow face and a cruel smile, had tapped the piano keys and played a clumsy, mismatched chord. The group burst into laughter, making jokes about how even a toddler could do better. That was when Edward's eyes had fallen on Marcus. "You there," Edward had called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Yes, you with a mop. Tell me, have you ever touched a piano before? Or do you just polish floors all day?" The others snickered. One woman in a glittering evening gown covered her mouth with a manicured hand, whispering something to the man beside her that made him grin. Marcus, ever composed, had simply glanced up and said nothing. The silence, however, seemed to provoke Edward further. He took a step toward Marcus, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble, each sound a little declaration of dominance. "Come now," he continued, waving his glass toward the grand piano as though presenting a grand opportunity. "Why don't you entertain us? Or are you afraid those hands of yours can't do more than wring out a mop?" Marcus's grip on the mop tightened ever so slightly. He had heard these kinds of comments before. The subtle digs at his job, the assumption that a man in his position couldn't possibly possess any refined skill or culture. He had learned to let such words wash over him, to keep his head down and his work steady. But Edward wasn't finished. His tone shifted from mockery to theatrical challenge. "I'll tell you what," he said, straightening his back and raising his voice so everyone in the vicinity could hear. "If you can play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata flawlessly, I'll not only give you $1,000. I'll marry you on the spot." The ridiculousness of the statement sent ripples of laughter through the gathered crowd. Guests at nearby tables turned their heads, some chuckling openly, others smirking as if they were watching a stage performance. A few exchanged knowing glances. This was nothing more than a public humiliation waiting to happen. One man whispered to his companion, "Beethoven? Flawlessly? He doesn't stand a chance." A young woman leaned forward in her seat, her eyes sparkling with the kind of morbid curiosity people get when they know they're about to witness someone's failure. Edward's friends leaned back in their chairs, amused. The younger man who had played the clumsy chord earlier smirked and muttered, "This should be good." Marcus stood still, saying nothing. His expression was unreadable. Neither anger nor embarrassment seemed to touch him. Then, without a single word, he set the mop aside, leaning it carefully against the wall. The soft thud of the handle against the marble echoed in the sudden quiet. Every pair of eyes followed him as he walked toward the piano. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost measured, as though each one carried weight beyond the moment. The laughter softened into murmurs, then faded into complete silence. Edward raised an eyebrow, still wearing that half-smile, but there was a flicker, just the faintest flicker, of curiosity in his gaze. Marcus reached the piano bench and paused for a moment, running his fingers lightly along the polished wood. The surface was cool beneath his touch, and for a brief second, his reflection stared back at him from its mirror-like shine. He lowered himself onto the bench with the same quiet precision, adjusting his position until he sat upright, his hands resting gently on his knees. Then, without looking at anyone, he reached forward and placed his fingers on the keys. The room held its breath. Even the chandelier's faint crystal tinkling seemed to fade away. The only sound was the faint, expectant creak of the piano bench beneath him. Marcus did not rush. His fingertips lingered above the ivory keys as though reacquainting themselves with an old friend. His eyes were calm, focused, almost distant, the kind of gaze that belonged to someone who knew exactly what they were about to do. In that moment, it was no longer a janitor sitting there. It was a man who had stepped into a challenge without fear. It was someone who understood that the next few minutes would not just be about playing music. They would be about revealing a truth that no one in that lobby was prepared for. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices hushed, but carrying a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Does he even know what keys to press?" One man murmured, leaning toward his wife, who stifled a chuckle behind a jeweled hand. "This is going to be embarrassing." Another woman whispered to her friend, her eyes flicking toward Edward with anticipation, as if she couldn't wait to see the billionaire's smug smile grow even wider when Marcus inevitably failed. Edward, meanwhile, leaned casually against the bar, one elbow propped on the counter, his champagne flute dangling loosely in his fingers. His posture screamed confidence, the sort of arrogance that came from always winning, from always being in control. He glanced briefly at his companions, his grin broadening as though to reassure them, "Don't worry. This will be over in seconds." But something shifted the moment Marcus placed his fingers gently on the keys. It was subtle, a flicker in his eyes, a tiny tightening of his jaw, as if he were stepping into a space that belonged entirely to him. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't flustered. He was calm. It was the kind of calm that didn't come from arrogance, but from certainty, from knowing deep down that you're about to do something no one in the room expects. Then, with a soft press of his fingertips, the first note rang out. It was a single tone, but it hung in the air like a drop of silver. And in that instant, something in the atmosphere shifted. The casual murmurs faded. The laughter stilled. The clink of glasses halted midair. Even the faint hum of the air, conditioning, seemed to grow quieter. Marcus didn't rush. His hands moved with deliberate grace, easing into the opening bars of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The haunting, gentle melody poured out, not just precise in pitch, but rich with emotion, the kind of emotion that made the music feel alive, breathing, almost human. The notes floated across the lobby like threads of moonlight weaving through the air. Each sound seemed to linger just a fraction of a second longer than the ear expected, pulling the listeners deeper into the moment. The deep, resonant bass notes gave way to delicate, almost fragile high tones, each one shimmering before dissolving into the next. It wasn't just that Marcus was playing correctly, it was how he was playing. His touch was neither too heavy nor too light. It was balanced, intimate, almost like a conversation between his soul and the instrument. Conversations stopped entirely. Forks were set down on plates without a sound. Drinks were lowered to tables, as if in slow motion. Even the waiters, trained to keep moving no matter what, stood frozen with trays in their hands, their eyes fixed on the man at the piano. Edward's smirk, so secure moments before, began to falter. At first, it was just a slight tightening around his mouth, a faint wrinkle in his brow. But as the music continued, the easy confidence in his posture began to erode. His glass, still held in his hand, was no longer being swirled lazily. Instead, it remained perfectly still, his grip tightening slightly, as if he needed something to hold on to. The sound of Marcus's playing filled every corner of the room, making the ornate lobby feel less like a place of idle chatter and more like a sacred hall meant only for this moment. His eyes closed, his head tilted slightly, and his entire body seemed attuned to the vibrations under his fingers. It was as though he wasn't merely pressing keys. He was pulling something from deep within himself and giving it to the room. A middle-aged man near the bar leaned forward, whispering to his companion, This isn't a beginner. This is professional." A young couple sitting by the window exchanged wide-eyed glances, the girl mouthing, "Wow," without making a sound. Even the skeptical murmurs from earlier were replaced by stunned silence. The only movement came from Marcus's hands, gliding effortlessly across the ivory keys, the left hand providing a steady, rich foundation while the right hand wove a fragile, melancholic melody over the top. There was something more than skill in his playing. There was pain, an undercurrent of sorrow in every phrase, as though each note carried the weight of a story untold. His posture was relaxed, but his expression, even with closed eyes, hinted at memories, perhaps regrets, that lived in the music itself. And still he played on. The tempo was perfect, not rushed to prove a point, not dragged for drama, just as Beethoven intended, though with an added personal depth that couldn't be taught. There was an intimacy in the way his fingers lingered on certain notes, a tenderness that seemed to hush even the faintest sound in the room. Edward shifted uncomfortably, no longer the picture of the amused, untouchable billionaire. His friends glanced at him sideways, their earlier grins replaced by a strange, almost guilty tension. It was becoming clear to them, and to Edward, that this wasn't going to end the way they had imagined. A woman in a green satin dress, seated near the center of the room, felt a sudden sting in her eyes. She blinked, startled by the tear threatening to fall. She didn't even like classical music, yet something about the purity of Marcus's performance had bypassed her mind entirely and gone straight to her heart. As the piece flowed into its deeper, more emotional passages, Marcus's playing became even more intense. Not louder, but more charged, as if each note were a confession, a truth he had never spoken aloud. His shoulders moved subtly with the rhythm, his entire body absorbed in the act of creation. The grand piano, so often just a decorative object in the lobby, seemed to come alive under his touch. Its polished black surface gleamed under the chandelier, reflecting the slow, deliberate movements of his fingers. Somewhere in the back, a waiter slowly set down his tray on an empty table, unable to keep balancing it while his focus was so entirely captured. An elderly man, sitting alone with a small cup of coffee, closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him as though it were taking him back decades to a memory he'd long forgotten. Marcus didn't open his eyes once. He didn't need to. He knew every inch of the piano, every subtle change in tone that came from pressing the keys just a little harder or a little softer. Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. His earlier words, the mockery, the bet, replayed in his head, but now they sounded hollow, foolish, even cruel. He had expected fumbling, wrong notes, an awkward scramble that would have sent his friends into fits of laughter. Instead, he was standing witness to something rare, something humbling. And still Marcus played. The melody swelled and faded like waves under moonlight, sometimes soft and fragile, sometimes rich and deep. The space between the notes was just as important as the notes themselves. Those brief, breathless silences where the sound seemed to hang in the air, giving everyone a moment to feel the weight of what they'd just heard. In those moments, the entire lobby seemed to belong to Marcus alone. Every person, from the wealthiest guest to the humblest worker, was caught in the same spell. And Edward Stanton, for perhaps the first time in his life, had nothing to say. By the time Marcus reached the middle movement, a tear rolled slowly down the cheek of an old woman seated near the front. She didn't bother to wipe it away. The music had touched something in her that words never could, a place deep inside where memories, both tender and painful, were kept locked away. She let the sound wash over her like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Around her, the guests sat or stood in stunned silence. Some stared at Marcus's moving hands as if hypnotized. Others glanced at one another with wide, questioning eyes. The disbelief was palpable, thick in the air like perfume. This wasn't simply good playing. This was artistry, the kind of performance that could fill a concert hall and earn a standing ovation from seasoned critics. A wealthy man standing in the back, dressed in immaculate white suit, leaned toward the person next to him and whispered in awe, "This is professional level. How does a janitor play like this?" His voice trembled slightly, as though he himself couldn't believe the words he'd just spoken. The question hung in the air, unanswered. No one in that lobby knew the truth. No one knew the years of quiet, lonely sacrifice behind every note Marcus played. The truth was something Marcus never shared openly. His life before the janitor's uniform was not a story he wore on his sleeve. It was a part of him he carried silently, like a private wound he refused to expose to the world. But if anyone had asked, really asked, they would have learned that years ago, before he ever picked up a mop or a bucket, Marcus was a rising piano prodigy. He had been born in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, a place where dreams rarely survived past childhood. The streets were cracked, the houses weathered and sagging, and the nights often echoed with the sounds of sirens. But inside the small, cramped apartment where Marcus grew up, there was one thing that shone brighter than any hardship, a dusty old upright piano that his grandmother had bought from a thrift store for $50. Marcus's earliest memories were of sitting on that worn wooden bench, his small fingers stretching awkwardly over the yellowed keys. At first, he'd bang out random sounds, laughing when the low notes rumbled and the high notes chimed like tiny bells. But soon, something deeper emerged. He began to hear patterns, to remember melodies, to teach himself simple songs by ear. By the time he was 7, he could play tunes he'd heard only once on the radio. By the time he was 10, he was reading sheet music borrowed from the local library. His teachers noticed. A local community center piano instructor offered to give him lessons for free, amazed at the boy's raw talent and determination. Marcus practiced for hours after school, sometimes so late into the evening that his mother had to drag him away from the bench to eat dinner. He didn't just play notes, he made the piano sing. Through sheer dedication and an almost obsessive passion for the craft, Marcus earned himself a scholarship to a prestigious music academy. It was a place he had only dreamed of. High ceilings, polished grand pianos in every practice room, and teachers who had themselves performed in some of the world's greatest concert halls. For a time, Marcus felt unstoppable. He pictured himself traveling the world, performing on the grandest stages, his name printed in bold letters on concert posters. But life has a way of altering even the most beautiful plans. When Marcus was 19, his mother fell gravely ill. The diagnosis was devastating and the treatment expensive. Insurance barely covered a fraction of the cost, and every day the bills piled higher. Marcus faced an impossible choice: continue his studies and watch his mother's condition worsen without proper care, or leave the academy and work full-time to keep her alive. It wasn't a choice at all. He withdrew from the academy quietly, packing up his music books and sheet scores into a cardboard box. His professors tried to persuade him to stay, but he simply smiled and told them he had personal matters to handle. He never told them the full truth. His days from then on were consumed by work. He took whatever jobs he could find: dishwashing, construction, delivery driving, but eventually he landed a steady position as a janitor at the very hotel where he now sat playing. The pay was modest, but it was enough to cover rent, groceries, and most importantly, his mother's medical bills. Dreams of concert halls, standing ovations, and international tours were quietly replaced with buckets, brooms, and cleaning shifts that often stretched into the early hours of the morning. But one thing Marcus refused to let die was his gift. Every night, after his shift ended and the hotel had grown quiet, Marcus would wander into the empty lobby. The grand piano sat there, gleaming under the dim glow of the chandelier. No one was around. The sound of his footsteps on the marble echoed softly as he approached. And there, in the stillness of the night, he would sit and play. He played not for applause, not for recognition, but because the music was still a part of him. It was the only thing that reminded him of who he truly was beneath the janitor's uniform. Sometimes, he'd play until the first light of dawn crept through the glass doors. Other nights, he'd stop after a few pieces, closing the lid gently before heading home. The hotel security cameras caught him more than once, but the manager never said a word. In fact, there were whispers among a few night staff members that they would sometimes linger in the shadows just to listen, claiming it was the most beautiful music they'd ever heard. Marcus never spoke of it. He didn't boast, didn't tell stories of his past to win sympathy or admiration. He carried his history like a folded letter tucked in his pocket, there if you looked for it, but never shown without reason. And now, in front of a stunned audience, all those years of secret practice, all those late nights spent in solitude, were unfolding in full view. Each note he played was a chapter in his story. The soft passages told of his childhood wonder. The swelling crescendos carried the weight of his sacrifices, and the delicate pauses spoke of the loneliness he had endured. In that lobby, Marcus was no longer just the man who cleaned the floors. He was the boy who had once dreamed of concert stages. He was the young man who had walked away from his own future to save the person he loved most. He was the pianist who had refused to let his gift vanish, no matter how heavy life became. The guests didn't know all of this. Not yet, but they could feel it in every note. It was the kind of truth you didn't need explained. It was carried in the music itself. And as the middle movement soared toward its peak, the line between janitor and artist dissolved completely, leaving only the man and his piano, bound together in the kind of performance people would remember for the rest of their lives. By the final note, the room seemed to hold its breath for a fraction of a second, as though no one wanted the magic to end. The last chord lingered in the air, resonating softly before fading into silence. Then, like a wave breaking against the shore, the entire lobby erupted into thunderous applause. It wasn't polite, restrained clapping. It was the kind of raw, uncontrollable response that came from people who had just experienced something unforgettable. Hands smacked together with urgency. The sound echoed off the marble floors and glass walls. People stood up from their chairs without thinking, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. The applause built in intensity, mingled with cheers and whistles. Some guests cupped their hands around their mouths to shout, "Bravo!" Others called out, "Encore!" in hopes that Marcus might play just one more piece. Even the hotel chef, a stocky man in a white uniform and tall hat, peeked out from the kitchen doorway. His eyes widened behind his glasses, his lips parting slightly as he took in the scene. This was the same man who had seen Marcus wiping counters and emptying trash bins just hours earlier. Yet here he was, standing like a maestro in his own private concert hall. And then there was Edward, the billionaire, so confident and smirking only minutes earlier, now stood frozen near the bar. His champagne glass trembled in his hand, a thin ring of bubbles rising lazily to the surface. His face, once lit with arrogance, was pale. He wasn't smiling anymore. His friends noticed. The earlier smirks on their faces had shifted into something else, discomfort, maybe even a hint of embarrassment. One of them, a tall man in a blue suit, leaned slightly toward Edward and raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said in a low, mocking tone that carried just enough of the people nearby to hear, "you made a promise." The jab was deliberate. Several guests turned their attention toward Edward, curious to see what he would do. The energy in the room was shifting again, and this time, the billionaire wasn't in control of it. Edward's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He glanced at Marcus, who was still seated at the piano, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his breathing slow and steady. The arrogance that had once coated Edward's features like armor had been stripped away, leaving something far more human, shame. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, uneasy expression. His eyes darted briefly to the crowd, then back to Marcus, as though he were searching for a way to recover from the mess he'd made. Finally, Edward set the champagne glass down on the bar with a soft clink and began to walk toward the piano. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, each one sounding louder in the quiet between applause. He kept his gaze fixed on Marcus, but there was no hostility there anymore. If anything, there was something closer to respect, or at least the beginnings of it. When he reached the edge of the piano, Edward paused, his voice low and uncertain. "You howl." He shook his head slightly, still looking at Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the image of the man before him with the one he thought he knew. "You play like a master. Why are you cleaning floors instead of performing in the biggest theaters in the world?" The question hung in the air, sincere yet tinged with disbelief. Marcus didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, his gaze drifting briefly toward the keys before meeting Edward's eyes. Then, with a faint, almost knowing smile, he said, "Life isn't always fair, sir. But talent doesn't disappear just because someone wears a janitor's uniform." The words were quiet, but they carried through the lobby like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every listener. There was no bitterness in his tone, no accusation, just simple truth. The crowd reacted instantly. A low murmur swept through the room, guests exchanging glances and nodding subtly in agreement. A woman near the staircase whispered, "He's right," to her companion. Another man, arms crossed, tilted his chin toward Edward with a look that clearly said, "Shame on you." Some guests' eyes lingered on Marcus with newfound admiration, their earlier assumptions about him shattered. They had watched him mop floors, hold doors open, and clear away empty glasses without a word. But now they saw him for what he truly was, an artist, a man of rare skill and discipline who had endured more than they could guess. Others turned their attention to Edward, and the change in their expressions was unmistakable. The charm and authority that had once surrounded him like a cloak seemed to have vanished, replaced by a faint air of ridicule. A few people didn't bother to hide their glares, their disdain for the way he had tried to humiliate Marcus clear in their eyes. Edward felt the weight of those stares. He was used to being the center of admiration, the man everyone wanted to please, but right now, he was the one being judged. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to embarrass Marcus, he had embarrassed himself. Marcus, however, didn't press the moment. He didn't gloat, didn't make a spectacle of Edward's discomfort. He simply sat there with a quiet dignity that only deepened the respect of those watching. The tension in the room lingered for a moment longer until one of the guests began to clap again, slower this time, as though sealing the end of the performance. Others joined in, the applause swelling once more, but now it was directed as much at Marcus's character as his skill. Edward stood there, still unsure of what to do next. His earlier bravado had given way to something unfamiliar, humility. And for the first time in a very long while, Edward Stanton had nothing clever to say. He took a step closer to Marcus, his voice softer now, almost sincere. "I owe you an apology," he said, though the words seemed to taste strange on his tongue. "I had no right to judge you." Marcus inclined his head slightly, the faint smile still on his lips. Apology accepted. He paused for a beat, then added with a touch of humor, "But about that marriage offer, I think I'll pass." The lobby erupted into laughter, the tension breaking like a burst of fresh air. Even Edward managed a sheepish chuckle, shaking his head at his own foolishness. But beneath the laughter, the lesson was clear to everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Appearances could be deceiving. Talent, dignity, and worth weren't defined by job titles or the clothes a person wore. And sometimes, the person you least expect to impress you can leave you speechless. Edward would leave the hotel that night, a little less arrogant than he had entered it. The sound of Marcus's playing etched into his memory. And Marcus, though he would return to his mop and bucket the next day, would walk with a quiet pride, knowing that his music had once again reminded the world of who he truly was. The room seemed to exhale in unison when Edward extended his hand, the gesture almost hesitant, as though even that small motion carried the weight of his pride. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the bravado that had clung to him earlier. "Marcus, I'm sorry for my words. I had no right to judge you." There was no flourish, no attempt to dress the apology in fancy phrases. Just simple, human sincerity. Marcus regarded him for a long moment, the faintest curve of a smile forming on his lips. In that silence, the audience could almost hear the unspoken history in Marcus's eyes. The long nights, the calloused fingers, the years of invisible labor. He finally reached out, clasping Edward's hand in a firm but measured grip. "Apology accepted," he said, his voice warm but steady, like a man who understood that dignity didn't need to be loud. Then, without missing a beat, he let his grin widen just enough for mischief to flicker. "But about the marriage offer, I think I'll pass." The crowd erupted in laughter, the tension in the room dissolving into a wave of genuine amusement. Some guests clapped again, not for the music this time, but for the way Marcus had carried himself, with grace, wit, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. Even Edward, red-faced, gave a weak chuckle, perhaps realizing that a little self-deprecation was the only way forward. But as the laughter subsided, a new figure emerged from the back of the room. A tall man in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair catching the warm glow of the chandelier, approached with measured steps. His eyes, sharp but kind, studied Marcus with the intensity of someone recognizing not just skill but potential. He stopped a few feet away and extended a business card between two fingers. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, his tone low yet brimming with certainty. "I'm a music agent. I've worked with some of the greatest pianists of our time, and I've never heard anyone play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata quite the way you just did. You don't belong behind a mop. You belong on stage." Marcus stared at the card as if it were a portal to a life he had once believed closed forever. He felt the glossy paper between his fingers, the embossed lettering catching the light. It seemed unreal, like a scene plucked from the kind of movies he used to watch as a boy, when he still believed dreams had no price tag. The other guests, sensing the moment's importance, went quiet. Even Edward shifted uneasily, as if realizing he was witnessing the first spark of something far greater than his own ego. I appreciate the compliment," Marcus replied softly, "but I haven't been on a real stage in years, and I don't even know if—" "You don't need to know," Daniel interrupted gently. "You just need to say yes to one opportunity. I'll take care of the rest." Those words lingered in Marcus's mind long after the night ended. He returned home to his modest apartment, the card resting on his kitchen table like an invitation to rewrite his entire life. He thought of his mother, of the sacrifices made, of the countless nights spent practicing when no one was watching. A part of him feared the risk. What if he failed? What if years of cleaning floors had dulled the sharpness of his gift? But another part, the part that had poured every ounce of himself into that performance, whispered that maybe this was fate knocking one more time. 2 weeks later, Marcus called the number on the card. The conversation was brief but decisive. Within a month, he was sitting at a gleaming black Steinway on the stage of small but respected recital hall in New York City, his name printed in elegant script on the program. It wasn't Carnegie Hall, not yet, but as the house lights dimmed and the audience hushed, Marcus felt the old electricity coursing through his veins. That night was the first of many. Word spread quickly about the janitor-turned-pianist, whose story moved audiences as much as his playing did. Newspapers printed his photo, captions calling him the man who made moonlight shine again. Concert invitations began pouring in Paris, Tokyo, Vienna. Each hall brought a standing ovation. Each ovation fueled Marcus's belief that he was exactly where he belonged. And Edward? He followed the headlines from afar, each article another reminder of the night that had humbled him. Eventually, he attended one of Marcus's performances, slipping into the audience quietly, almost anonymously. When the final note echoed through the hall and the crowd rose to its feet, Edward clapped until his palms stung. After the concert, he approached Marcus backstage. There were no cameras this time, no audience to impress. Just two men who had once stood on opposite sides of arrogance and respect. "You were right," Edward said simply. "Talent doesn't disappear. I'll never make that mistake again." Marcus smiled, offering his hand once more, not because he needed closure, but because he knew kindness was the higher note to end on. Then we're both better men than we were that night. From that moment, Edward became one of Marcus's quiet supporters, donating anonymously to music programs for underprivileged kids. He never again judged someone by their job title or appearance. And Marcus? His name eventually did light up the marquee at Carnegie Hall. As he stepped onto that stage for the first time, the lights blinding and the applause deafening, he thought of the hotel lobby, the Moonlight Sonata, and the unlikely chain of events that had brought him there. Somewhere deep down, he knew that life had a way of circling back, that sometimes the floor you mop today can be the stage you stand on tomorrow. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.